I was very thrilled to be able to come and talk about something that hopefully is near and dear to most of our hearts, which is accessibility. And how do we make sure that we are delivering projects at scale that are accessible to the widest possible audience that we can do, and some of the things that we're doing at Human Made, the approaches that we're taking to ensure that for the projects that we're in. And just to start off, some reminders. First off, the WordPress project does have an accessibility, a whole accessibility statement that you can find on the WordPress.org website at about/accessibility. It starts off with this great statement that I think encapsulates what should be our product vision in general, which is that the WordPress community and the open source WordPress project is committed to being as inclusive and accessible as possible. We want users, regardless of device or ability, to be able to publish content and maintain a website or application built with WordPress, a noble goal. On top of that, I think it's also important that not just the authoring experiences and the tools that we build on the back end are important, but the experiences that we deliver to our end users, that those are accessible as well, are a very important goal. There's several things that factor into that, and I think those of you in this room probably are very familiar with the business use cases for why accessibility is important. A few reminders. The World Health Organization recently published that 15% of the world population have some form of disability. That is a pretty large number of folks that make up a substantial user base for our products, for our content. We want to make sure that they can use and they can access all of the things that we're building. This number is expected to increase as the general population gets older. So a fun way to think about building accessible websites is let's build the web that we want to have for ourselves in the future as we're all growing older. I think everybody in this room is growing older, right? So just as a business use case, I know we've all worked on tons of projects where we spend a lot of extra time and effort to make sure that we've got browser compatibility for older browsers. IE 11, I think the last time I checked, has got about a 2% market share in terms of internet usage, and so 15% is a bigger number than 2%. So if we're going to factor in extra time in our projects and extra budget for some particular thing, accessibility is a good target. Also, and I was reminded of this even as I was preparing this talk, my dad called me just a couple of days ago. He had gotten out of surgery, wrist surgery, to correct something from a previous accident. And so for the next couple of weeks, he's wearing a sling and a cast, and he doesn't have full use of both arms and hands and the things that he would normally use to access the web through devices, whether it be mobile or a desktop device. And so when we think about accessibility, we need to think about a couple of different stages that I think Microsoft did a really good job of illustrating a few years ago in their inclusive design manual. When we think about accessibility, it's not just sort of the permanent use case, but we also have temporary and situational use cases where accessibility is really important. I was reminded by a colleague even this week that probably the most important blind and deaf user that we have on the internet is a robot called Google that I think we all care about deeply. So, so accessibility is important from a business use case to make sure that we are creating things that are available for as many people as possible. On top of that, there has been an uptick the last several years in lawsuits relative to accessibility. Domino's Pizza, Winn-Dixie, Dick Blick, Harvard and MIT both have had pretty substantial class action lawsuits over the last few years, and all about ADA compliance and making sure that we're not blocking access to people to be able to just do commerce on the web, do things as web is becoming the #1 way that people access content, access services, that those are accessible to as many people as possible. It's a legal requirement, and so we want to make sure that we're not delivering services, we're not delivering products for our clients, or on as if we are in this room building products, that we're not locking out folks in ways that could potentially affect us over the long term with some legal risks. So anyway, how we've been approaching this at Human Made is first off, make sure that accessibility is a part of our earliest product conversations. As we start to work on a project, the worst way I think that you can succeed in a project in terms of set of goals is to work on what you think is the core project, and then at the end sort of scramble to see if you can like QA pass everything through a QA step. And so start right at the beginning with setting those accessibility metrics that you want to hit. Talk about the plan for in terms of functionality, in terms of content, in terms of brand requirements, and really pay attention to the planning of what's going to be important from the earliest stages. So prevention is better than cure. On one of a project we worked on recently, one of the first things that we did in one of the first sprints is we did an overall content audit just to identify what are some potential risks that we're going to have to be aware of as we go through the process. This particular client had a lot of PDF content that we were porting over that we needed to make sure up front that we had a plan for how do we make sure that content is as accessible as possible, how much of that can we start to port over into an HTML first solution and build their team's tools to be able to publish this stuff in more accessible ways in the future. Color contrast, taking a look at even the brand standards of some of the projects we're working on and giving advice up front to design teams internally about what are safe color options and what are not, and advise up front so we're not having to fix things at the end of the project on designs that were handled inappropriately. Typography, things like avoiding all caps and subheadings, which is a popular thing to do, but turns out is really, really difficult on screen readers. Make sure that borders on tables have contrast ratios that are appropriate. Make sure that we're watching out for contrast ratios and alternative text for images and icons, infographics and charts, making sure that we're not relying just on color to convey information, that we're providing text alternatives where necessary. An example of one of the things that we did as a part of this project, as I mentioned before, is even just putting together a really simple color palette contrast ratio table that we could share with their creative teams. So as they were designing product, both for what we were working on, but then going future for anything else that they were working on, they had a really good sense of how they could apply their brand standards in ways that were also accessible. The accessibility team that's part of the WordPress project has done an amazing job the last few months, amassing resources, publishing best practices guides that you can share with your engineering teams right now that will really help to educate folks on not only the stuff that we should be doing by default that are kind of expected, but the latest best practices that are changing, that ways to test accessibility, those sorts of things. There's just a slew of information there that's super helpful that will get your team up to speed, and I would recommend that you take a look at that. Also, one of the things that we did is include accessibility in our code review process. I think most of us in our code review processes pay attention to things like security, pay attention to things like performance. Accessibility, just making that another one of the things that we pay attention to in those code review processes. We had several developers working on this particular project that I was working on recently that exclaimed at the end that having accessibility standards in that code review process they found really difficult but rewarding, and we saw the increased just knowledge and capability of our own team as we included that in part of the process. We have published a lot of the accessibility best practices in our coding standards website that I think many of us share our engineering best practices with the community, so I would recommend that you take a look at that and continue to publish your own accessibility best practices, and let's share those resources together. Also, we need to make sure that we are using the best and the latest automated testing tools to knock down some of the manual labor that it takes to do these sorts of things, much like we do with code sniffing and performance automated checks. And so there are a couple tools that are really useful that are out on the market right now. One is called Axe Core, and they have a JS library that you can bundle in your testing frameworks. They have a browser extension for folks who are part of maybe your QA teams, or even just a really easy way to take a look at the web pages that you're working on and seeing a very fast set of things that need to be corrected. They also have a really helpful command line tool wrapper around their tools that you can automate as a part of your like linting process, if that's something that your development team does. We found that very useful, and even like making that a part of when we're building like pattern libraries. That's a really easy time to run automated checks on sort of the components that you're building that then build up into the bigger projects that you're using, and getting really quick feedback on just basic errors that you might make, even with color contrast and some of those sorts of things. Pally, P-A-1-1-Y, is another really good tool. They use a different underlying library, HTML code sniffer, and they also have a JS library and a CLI tool. Both of those are really great resources to look at. And you can automate the common error checking, like I said, but not behavioral intent. And this is important to keep in mind. There still is a need for some manual checks for things like screen readers, for things like what's supposed to happen as you tab through an interface with a keyboard. And so not forgetting just some of those basic things, we found cuts down on a majority of the mistakes right out of the box. And just making that a part of your habits leads to better products at the end. Some additional reading that I'll leave behind. Like I said, the make.wordpress.org accessibility handbook is a really great resource. We have published some of our best practices on the engineering guide, our engineering handbook at HumanMade. We will continue to do so. We would love feedback on anything that you find that we should be doing that we're not doing, or things that you're doing in that regard. W3.org has a lot of great tutorials. The allyproject.com has some really good information, and inclusivecomponents.design have started to amass a really nice collection of sort of advanced web sort of patterns that we see happening often, and how to implement those in accessible ways. That is a really great resource for your teams to consult as well. So with that, thank you, and let's build a more accessible web together.